listening to The World According to Jen and Carolyn. So sophisticated. Hey, how's it going?
Hey, friend.
You ready to talk about the CIA?
Oh, I know so much more than I knew a month ago.
Dude, there's so much to know. I'm ready to talk about the CIA, and at the same time, not quite ready to talk because we had artichokes tonight and they were fucking terrible. Sorry, Costco. I love everything you do, but these artichokes were bad.
Are you choking on it?
It's a little bit better now, but some of the hairs that are in the heart are kind of lodged in the...
Gross.
You know, the right side of my trachea. So that's a bit annoying, but
You should have listened to your husband. He seems to know how to cut a good artichoke.
That's his area of expertise.
Did it wrong, didn't we?
After almost 14 years of being with this dude, I'm still doing it wrong. Try as he might to mansplain it to me. No, he doesn't mansplain. He's pretty good.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk to you about the CIA, Latin America, and immigration because we know that so few people, particularly Americans, know about the connection between migration from Latin American countries and what the CIA did in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in these countries. So if you've ever wondered why so many migrants from Central America, South America, and Mexico come to the U.S., we're going to tell you why. It's not because America is the greatest country on earth. No. It has more to do with the lingering effects of American colonial interventionist policies through the CIA and coups orchestrated and perpetrated by the CIA. So we also have to talk about NAFTA too, because if we're talking about migration from Mexico, it is really important to talk about NAFTA and why people are desperate and economically impoverished coming from Mexico.
Yeah.
So, and I've always been really into this shit, or at least from my college years. Yeah. I was so into it. I married a man from Guatemala. But really, hearing his immigration story, coming here undocumented when he was 5, like going through the desert with his mom, who was 8 months pregnant with his sister at the time, like saying how the smell of tangerines always reminds him of crossing the border because they put them under a piece of plywood, him and his mom, and maybe some other migrants, and put tangerines on top of them. So they wouldn't get searched. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. And so they came here fleeing the Guatemalan Civil War that the U.S. helped start. We're going to talk about how that all happened. Yeah. But they would have never left Guatemala. Right. They were established in Guatemala. Both of his parents were teachers. They came here and worked in factories and had to dodge, La Migra. It wasn't called ICE back then, all the time. Like there were times they would show up to their factory jobs, or one time in particular, they were running late for some reason. And thank God they were, because there was a raid. Wow. But that is what desperate people do. And we're going to learn how that desperation in a lot of Latin American countries is really our fault.
Well, and I feel like it's always been relevant. Yeah. It's never not been relevant, but it's like especially relevant right now because it's, if you grew up like me and you weren't taught these things and you were just taught the version of an immigrant and not the reason why they were immigrating.
That's right.
And it's so different than when I hear the immigration stories of Middle Eastern Jews coming to America. Yeah. And it's a very different, because of their race. Yes. It's a very racist and biased look at saying who is okay to be an immigrant and who isn't. Yep. And again, I feel like
everybody's had their turn being othered, but some people, whoops, I hit the microphone. Some people are able to assimilate more quickly because they're white. Right.
Right. Well, and I watched, everything is always like what I watch that like triggers a educational impulse, but I've been watching Mo on Netflix, which it's really good. You're going, I say you're going to love it. It's going to be really heartbreaking as well, but it's a story of, a man, and he's a comedian. Yeah. And his character, Muhammad, comes from Iran in the 80s, which many people did. Yes. And his story, and it's sort of, it takes this sort of like comical look at immigration.
Yeah.
And then in like the third or fourth, it's heavy. In like the fourth episode, shit gets really real because he finds out, sorry, spoiler alert, about torture that his dad went through and he didn't know and all this stuff. And, you know, this is the stories that we need to be hearing and that are out there.
Yep.
And it's really sad that it has to come to Netflix for someone like me to then look at it when I've known people my whole life who, you know, are Palestinian and are dealing with this. And we don't really, in social media and media in general, we don't talk about the actual stories. We just talk about the immigrant.
We do. And full circle moment, our first coup, us being the U.S., perpetrated by the CIA, was in Iran.
1953.
We destabilized the region.
Well, and think if we hadn't done that. I don't think what we were seeing, well, and that all ties in with America's war on communism in general.
Well, that was the justification given for going into Latin America.
Yep.
It was these people are communist, and in some cases they were.
Who cares? Communism,
but they were democratically, but they were democratically elected, and it wasn't about spreading the flow of communism. We're going to talk about it.
It was about workers' rights and unions and
resources, wanting access to those resources, and
theirs.
Yeah, let's start from the beginning, right?
Hey, let's do it.
We're going to talk about Guatemala, which is about resources. So this is our second coup, right? The first one, as we said, was in Iran. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated Operation PB Success to overthrow democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz after he sought to nationalize lands owned by United Fruit. Okay. Who was the United Fruit? The United Fruit guy, those were the Dulles brothers. So one of them was the, I'm going to get into it here, but because I can't remember, but one of them was like the head of United Fruit. And he was like, hey, brother who runs the CIA or, you know, the precursor. No, it was the CIA at that point. Like, help me out.
Conflict of interest much?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it's crazy. So after they deposed this guy, a military dictatorship followed, triggering decades of political violence. Thus, my ex-husband coming to the U.S. in the very early 80s. So the Guatemalan Civil War spanned from 1960 to 1996.
Wow.
It was a protracted and devastating conflict between the Guatemalan government and various left-wing guerrilla groups. Read a book. It will fuck you up. It's called Bridge of Courage.
Bridge of Courage.
It's written by a white lady named Jennifer Harberry, who married a dude from Guatemala who was a guerrilla fighter. But it's all these like really sad stories. But you
gotta read that shit though.
It's
to
very
understand.
Important. Yes.
Yeah.
So and the war resulted in over 200,000 deaths and disappearances, with indigenous Mayan communities disproportionately affected. So you've met my ex. He looks very Mayan.
He does.
But his grandfather was assassinated. His grandfather was a police officer. Killed. Guatemala. So they were going after everyone. And just like what's happening right here in this country, whenever there's an authoritarian regime taking hold, they get rid of the educators.
Yes.
So his parents were on the chopping block too. So major events and human rights violations. So where am I here? So background and causes. So the root of the conflict, this conflict that I'm talking about in Guatemala, traces back to deep-seated social, economic, and political inequalities in Guatemala. So this 1954 CIA-backed coup that ousted the president only exacerbated tensions by reversing progressive reforms and suppressing dissent. This led to widespread discontent, particularly among indigenous and rural poor people. And so throughout the 36-year conflict, the Guatemalan military and associated paramilitary groups committed extensive human rights abuses, massacres, disappearances, systemic torture. The UN-sponsored Historical Clarification Commission found that 93% of these violations were perpetrated by government forces. 83% of the identified victims were indigenous people. So in Cuba, this was not quite a coup, but the CIA, actually what Castro and my boy Che did was ousted somebody who was super friendly to American interests and said, fuck this, we're taking Cuba back. So in CIA, or in 1961, the CIA backed what we know as the failed Bay of Pigs invasion that they hoped would result in the overthrow of Fidel. Aiming to topple his revolutionary socialist government, the botched mission only strengthened Castro's rule and aligned Cuba more closely with the Soviet Union. I got my issues with Castro, don't get me wrong, but let's talk about the literacy rate in Cuba compared to the literacy rate, the rate here, or the illiteracy rate here, rather. Like education was of primary importance. And guess what? When you are on an island, literally an island, and you're the only socialist country, and there are no other socialist countries to trade with, interact with, etc., you're never going to be able to succeed.
Yeah.
So don't get me wrong. I'm not going to go into it. I have some issues with Castro, but he and Che in particular did a lot of good things too. So let's talk about Brazil in 1964. The CIA supported a coup against President Goulart, who was accused of being sympathetic to communists. The military regime took hold, lasting for 2 brutal decades. Then we have Chile. The CIA assassinated or assisted in the coup against socialist president Salvador Allende, who was democratically elected. And then you had fucking Augusto Pinochet, who was a general. Yeah. Then his dictatorship followed, marked by widespread repression and human rights abuses. They turned a whole ass soccer stadium into a place where they were committing torture against people. It is frightening. We had Nicaragua in the 80s. The CIA funded and armed the Contras to overthrow the leftist Sandinista government after the revolution against a U.S.-backed dictator. The conflict left thousands dead and destabilized the region. Grenada, Panama, the list goes on, you guys. And these CIA-backed coups often had lasting consequences. Like we said, political repression, weakened democracies, instability across the region, economic ramifications. So, here's a breakdown of common themes and key examples in Latin America, or why these coups were perpetrated against these countries. So privatization, economic liberalization. Many coups led to U.S.-aligned governments that prioritized neoliberal policies such as privatization, deregulation, and free trade agreements. Look at Chile, the 1973 coup. After Pinochet took power, the so-called Chicago Boys, these were U.S.-trained economists who went to the University of Chicago. They studied under Milton Friedman, a very famous free market economist, implemented radical free market reforms. See, I'm going from memory and then going back to my notes. This is how much I know about this shit. This included mass privatization, cuts to social programs, weakened labor protections. While GDP eventually grew, inequality skyrocketed. Resource exploitation for U.S. corporations. In Guatemala, we talked a bit about United Fruit. Yeah. Subsequent government rolled back land reforms, benefiting U.S. agribusiness while impoverishing local farmers. In Nicaragua, we had the U.S.-backed Contra forces sabotaged infrastructure and destabilized the economy to maintain U.S. influence. And then there's another reason, economic inequality and concentration of wealth. So many of these U.S.-backed regimes strengthen ties between political elites and multinational corporations like United Fruit, which exacerbate wealth inequality. Brazil, 1964, which we mentioned, the military government promoted industrialization but suppressed wages and crushed unions. This benefited the elitists and the U.S. So it contributes to stagnation and economic instability. Look at Argentina. Under the military junta, foreign debt exploded. Inflation soared and economic policies were mismanaged, contributing to the 1980s Latin American debt crisis. So all of this, right? We have Chile, Pinochet's initial shock therapy reforms. This is what we talked about in our last episode, disaster capitalism, shock and awe. They caused a deep recession, unemployment, and a banking crisis, loss of social safety nets, agricultural displacement. We saw in Guatemala, U.S.-backed governments privatized exports over local food production, displacing indigenous farmers, long-term debt crisis. Look at what happens with the IMF and the World Bank.
They ruin these cultures and these economies.
Yes, and you're impoverishing these people. You're making them dependent on you. And don't get me started on the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund because they're thugs by another name. Right. There's another book that people should read called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It talks about all of this. It talks about the economic justification for these coups.
It has to be.
It always ties back.
Or democracy.
Right.
But it's about power. It's about power and money.
Yeah. We don't give a shit. Clearly, we don't give a shit about democracy. Look what's happening to our democracy. Yeah. So, while some business sectors thrived post-coup, most Latin American nations endured greater poverty, inequality, and weakened democratic governance due to these economic policies. Would you like more detailed case studies on a particular country? Thanks, AI. No. So, Carolyn, can you talk about the relationship between immigration to the U.S. and CIA-backed coups in Latin America and Latin America and the deep interconnection? So talk to me a little bit about, I'm trying to figure out what's here. What happened with these notes? This might be me, y'all.
Let me talk about some of the psychological implications.
There we go.
That all the things that you're talking about, specifically, the main reason that we're talking about this. And again, if you want to look into the CIA and the reasons behind it and where it started, I mean, we were basically just jealous that Russia had the KGB, and we were like, I want that too.
KGB is so hot right now.
It's not funny. And again, we have to laugh because it's so fucked up. But I talked about this in a TikTok post. There's a wonderful 9-part documentary, volume 3. Chapter 3 is called, I think it's called Intellectual Insanity or something like that. It's on the CIA. It's called Turning Point.
Okay, that's the one you were talking about on TikTok.
It's kind of changed my life because I was not taught this stuff in education. And because I thought at the time I was so lucky that I passed the AP exam and therefore didn't have to take history in college, which thrilled me so I can get out of college faster and not have to pay money.
Yeah.
And again, I was 20, so I'm just going to blame it on my dumb immaturity. The only reason I know things historically is because of my friendships with people like you who are invested in these things. And I would listen and you would tell me stuff, but I wasn't learning this in school. Yeah. And this is a problem because even going to, I would say, kind of liberally type schools.
Well, dude, you went to SF State. This is why I feel really sad that you
were take history there.
That's what I'm saying. I'm sad that you were deprived of that opportunity because it would have been more radical because SF State is known to be radical.
Right. But the schools that I went to for lower education, we didn't learn any of this.
No, of course
it was
not.
Completely revised. It was everything that America did was great.
Right.
And, it's really important that we learn this. So you can learn so much about like the forming and the history in that sense. That's not really what we're focusing on. It's really about the individual stories. And so that's what we want to focus on is what actually happens. And this is important for Republicans and MAGA. Maybe we've lost them, but someone who is maybe on the cusp or starting to regret their Trump decisions, I hope. You have to, this isn't just looking at a mass of people. You're looking at individuals. Right. So I'm going to go into a little bit about our nervous system again. Human beings innately need safety. Any mammal, any animal needs safety. And we are animals after all. Yeah. We have our biological systems are actually devoted to fiercely avoid harm. And our body's rapid response survival system, the automatic nervous system or ANS, is comprised of 3 elements: dorsal, sympathetic, and ventral. And all you need to know about that is that they're subconsciously working in the background to read subtle signs for safety and threat. Being forced to flee one's home, your home, your community, your state.
Nobody wants to do that.
I don't even want to leave San Francisco and move to fucking Oakland.
No, that's why that narrative is so fucked.
Yes.
Oh, they want to come. We're so great. They just want to be here.
It's like, don't.
No, their homes have been fucked. Yeah. And to a large extent by U.S. policy.
Yes. 100% by that. And so, when you're forced to leave, and I think that word, you're forced.
Yeah.
Due to political instability that the U.S. called violence and economic hardship, especially when those crises are linked to foreign interventions. Like you said, there's just going to be a psychological and a physiological effect and what we know intergenerational trauma, which if you don't understand what that means, if I am to have a baby right now, I have all the eggs that I'm going to have, right? When I'm born. I was in my mother's uterus. Therefore, those were formed in her. Yeah. So my child was there in my mother's uterus, if that makes sense.
No, it does.
It's kind of those Russian nesting dolls image I want you to have.
Passed down matrilineally.
And that is absolutely true. Yeah. And so apparently it's also paternal as well. There's a book called It Didn't Start With You. And I will find that section because it's a little more complicated.
Well, I'm so glad it lets women off the hook because why are we responsible for fucking everything that's wrong with this world? I'm so tired of it. Please give me some male blame.
I will find some of it.
Good.
Yes. So I'll go through them. So many, and I think the number one and really what you could sum up any mental health issue is stress and trauma. Yeah. Or post-traumatic stress disorder, complex PTSD. Many individuals who flee their countries experience violence, threats, persecution like you and I don't know. You know,
no, we could never imagine.
I'm talking
things.
rape, torture,
yes.
abuse during their migration. And that's just maybe where their homeland is. Then they have their migration journey, as you talked about.
Oh, you mean the coyote who helped my ex-husband and his mom get across the desert, who turned to his mom and said, if you go into labor, I'm fucking leaving you here.
Oh, Jesus
Can
Christ.
you imagine that?
No, I can't imagine that because I've never had to. And that's the problem.
Oh.
So obviously this leads to stress, if you are having flashbacks, hypervigilance, or any emotional numbness, you might have post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. Those who escape may experience guilt, leaving loved ones behind and having survived when others did not. That's called survivor's guilt. And this is an actual emotional distress. And it's even will hinder your ability to adapt to your new environment. People experience this when they've lost someone and they survive all these different things. So this, I think we've seen in other ways as well, loss of identity and cultural displacement. Yeah. Imagine leaving a place that's rich with culture and coming to fucking America.
Well, it's rich with a ton of different types of culture. That's what makes America great, though. Like, I don't want to shit on America, especially where we're from. Yeah. We are just surrounded. We're inundated in San Francisco by other cultures. And that is what makes America great. Not ostracizing people. Right. We are a nation of fucking immigrants.
I disagree though in a little bit because think of what happens to the person who's the other in America. You know, I mean, I think that's the utopian ideal you and I subscribe to, and the people that are listening to us do. I think that people definitely don't treat others that way. It's even true. In a city like San Francisco.
Unless you can find your own community.
Well, like look at our usually do.
Yeah. Look at our like Chinese, Cantonese community. But even outside of Chinatown, like we have so many folks from China and particularly from Canton province that the community is tight. Yeah. Like you have that community support. Granted, we still have like incidents of Asian hate and shit, but that community is solid here.
Well, and you know, again, you're going to lose that sense of, when I've asked people, it's that sense of belonging, that cultural tradition, social support. You have to create that. Right. And, you know, if I had a client who ended up moving to Nebraska.
Oh, geez.
And he was the only Korean American there.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, so in a city like San Francisco where people are coming in, or a place like New York or something like that, perhaps, but I think that you're often trying to integrate into a new society and assimilate. Yeah. And then you try and assimilate and you're not quite American enough and you're not quite part of your culture enough. It's very complicated.
Learning the language.
Learning the language.
Somewhere where you don't speak the motherfucking language. It is.
And you know what always upsets me is when someone who speaks another language apologizes to me because they don't speak English. I'm like, no, I'm sorry. Yeah. I don't speak two languages like you.
Or like most other people around the world. Yeah.
I'm a dumb American. Right. I took French and German. They've gotten me nowhere.
Useless.
Useless unless I go to Germany or France. Anyway, obviously anxiety, uncertainty. Many asylum seekers and refugees live with ongoing uncertainty about their legal status and safety for their families and their future. The chronic stress can contribute to anxiety, depression, intergenerational trauma. I talked about that a little bit, but children of refugees may inherit feelings of insecurity, fear, mistrust. And even if they end up growing up in a more stable environment that their parents left, you know, there's often a lot of discourse between the family too, from parent to child, economic, social stress, and mental health professionals, try as they might, really want to provide critical support to individuals who have fled their homelands due to violence, political instability, and hardships. But what do you do when you get a therapist like me? You know, and yes, I'm empathetic, and yes, I've been trauma informed, and yes, I'm culturally humble, or at least
nice white
girl. But I don't understand, and and the main thing in therapy is you need to have a good relationship. Right. So, you know who I'm talking about. But there's a certain supervisor that we both know, who at a job we worked at, who used to tell me like, you know, well, did you bring up your race, and did you bring up this, and did you bring up that? I'm like, I'm not going to bring anything up unless they bring it up, right? You know, there's not this like, well, I know I'm a white person, so like, can you please educate me? It's more like,
well, then it becomes performative.
Well, exactly. You know, it's like, hey, I don't know. Tell me your story. Yeah. Like, I actually don't know. Yeah. Like, teach me. But also, you know, it's not your job as this Mexican-American client to teach me about your culture. I'm supposed to come in knowing stuff too.
Stress on them.
Yes.
Like, why is it their responsibility to teach you? Like,
well, and that's the thing that you want. And going back to DEI, I want to see more men in therapy. I want to see more African Americans in therapy. I want to see more biopic. I want to see transgender therapists. We need the community of therapists and healers and people in public health.
Don't worry, I'm trying to start a program.
Cool. Thanks, friend. So I'm talking about this, what we need. Now, I was very lucky. The school I chose, USF. Yeah. The one thing they do really well is social justice.
Yes.
I think I got one semester or 2 months on alcoholism, but I got 2 semesters of cultural sensitivity. So, they put their money where their mouth is. So if you are going to seek help, and you don't need to seek help. I think there's a lot of resources, but I hope you find someone who's trauma informed as an organization and making sure that they're having those initiatives on their staff.
Totally.
You want a culturally sensitive therapist and culturally relative practices.
Right.
You want to address intergenerational trauma. You also don't want to assume that any of these things are happening because that'd be really fucked up too. But you do want to know that this is often not something that culture would typically do.
Right.
And so you need to be sensitive to that and you need to support identity and belonging. And I also think the most important thing is community-based healing and making sure that person is connected to that.
Yeah.
But at the top of the line is every single therapist and social worker and anyone who's board of behavioral health services, we need to be advocating for systemic change.
Yes.
I want more diversity in supervisors, in therapy, in networks. And we have to stand up and make sure that that's happening and advocate for people. And we also should not have an anti-immigrant rhetoric. No,
we absolutely shouldn't. And as you and I have discussed, the economic barrier for folks who want to go into clinical work is extremely high.
Yes.
And in our society of systemic racism, where folks of color are, often don't have the resources to be able to do these things, like this is where the government comes in San Francisco. I can't talk about my work, or I refuse now to talk about my work on this forum. I think I feel safer not talking about it.
Okay.
And I'll just say, as somebody who works in local government, like it's San Francisco and we're going to hold it down. But I don't want to inadvertently expose anybody to repercussions. I just don't trust. I don't trust right now. It's really scary times. It's like, So anyway, speaking of scary times and dirty ass motherfuckers, we're going to talk about the Dulles brothers. I alluded to them earlier. So John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, they were instrumental in shaping U.S. foreign policy during the 1950s, particularly through their involvement in CIA-backed coups in Latin America. Does your documentary go into them, right?
They go into everything.
Good.
You gotta watch this.
I do. I remember you're like, who are those brothers? I'm like, the Dulles brothers. You're like, yeah, bitch. I'm like, yeah. So John Foster Dulles, that's what he was. He was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. So prior to his role, he was a senior partner at a law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell, where he represented United Fruit, a major American corporation with extensive interests in Latin America. So his brother, Allen Dulles, was appointed as director of the CIA during the same administration. Notably, Allen had served on United Fruit's board of trustees and owned shares in the company, further intertwining the brothers' interest with United Fruit. One of the most significant interventions orchestrated by the Dulles brothers was that 1954 coup that we mentioned. And this was all about our Benz, the democratically elected president, saying, you know what? We are going to take this land back. This American company is not going to be able to operate here and pay people, shit wages and treat people poorly. And so that was the reason for the coup. So journalist Stephen Kinzer in his book, The Brothers, John Foster Dulles, Alan Dulles, and Their Secret World War, delves into how the Dulles brothers' actions, driven by their corporate affiliations and anti-communist stance, led to the overthrow of several foreign leaders. Their legacy includes significant interventions in countries like Iran, Guatemala, the Congo, often resulting, as we said, in long-term geopolitical consequences. You know, anybody who is very MAGA that we would say these things to in terms of justification as to why there are so many people coming from Latin America would be like, well, that happened X amount of years ago. And it's like, they're the same people who are like, well, slavery ended, you know, and Jim Crow ended. I'm like, no,
well, first of all, it didn't.
There are people that I know whose grandparents were impacted by Jim Crow. Bro, at the mortuary, I saw my stepdad, who's a black man. His fucking birth certificate said colored on it. He was born in the 40s, dude. Like, this stuff, one, it didn't happen that long ago. Two, the consequences don't go away.
Yeah.
The consequences associated with the trauma, the intergenerational trauma, as we said, the political ramifications, the economic ramifications, these aren't things that just disappear overnight.
Well, I love when someone who has no skin in the game,
right,
has an opinion about something.
Right. Or they're coming here and taking our resources. Like, why is it our problem that their country's a mess? And it's like, because we
did
caused
that to
mess.
them.
We did it, dude. And there are still people who would listen to this episode
right now,
hear all of this, know that this isn't bullshit, because you can easily look this stuff up yourself and still say, no, they don't belong here. Like, they can't, it's not our fault. We have absolutely no obligation. And I'm like, I don't see it that way.
My question for them is then, I want to know how you were raised.
Yeah, I'm real curious.
Because I am the way I am because there was a split in my family.
Yeah.
And I can't speak for him because he's not here to say it. And I don't know if he would have changed his tune, but my dad didn't have a very progressive view of things.
Right. That's putting it mildly.
Yeah. Well, my dad's famous quote was, I'm not racist. I hate everyone equally. And to his point, he really did, especially himself. But yes, my mother had the other side of it.
Yeah.
And I was raised watching television and only saw black comedy shows. So it was always like, but wait, Dad said this.
Yeah.
So I
grew up in a good time. You know, I had very racist family members. Like, even my mom, who's a lesbian and dated black women, was racist.
Yeah.
But we are very fortunate to have grown up with black culture.
Yeah.
We had In Living Color. We had incredible music. You know, we were talking about a different world today. And we grew up in an incredibly diverse neighborhood or area.
But that's the only saving grace, is that I had this other viewpoint to be like, but wait, but I would always go, but this is what I hear at home.
Yeah.
This is what my parents saying.
Yeah.
And I never believed a word my dad said, thank God. But, you know, also this is learned.
Right.
You are taught this stuff and it's intentional.
Yeah.
It is not inherent. But even as a kid, there were things that I've done that I think about in recent times that I go, that was racist.
Sure. Of
that
course.
was
Me too.
hurtful.
Me too.
And it was because I was modeling things I saw.
We didn't know better, but we know better now.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. A lot of people are not willing to unlearn. And I know it must be, I don't have some sort of deep attachment to my family at all. I know you're different. Mm-hmm. I don't feel badly or like I'm turning my back on some deep-seated family values. And I'm like, fuck them. They were racist. They said horrible things. And I'm so glad that I unlearned that as quickly as I did.
Yeah.
But I can only imagine that somebody who has a deep connection to their family and holds their father and their mother on a very high pedestal.
And didn't have the environment.
That's right.
And their mind.
Right.
To have the option. So I think it goes back to, I really don't want to talk facts with people that have a belief system that is counter to mine, because it's not going to, you're right. Like, the facts are there.
Yeah.
And they could say, well, someone else, like, it's there in picture. You can hear interviews, you can hear people saying stuff. I want to understand get them to talk about their belief systems and where they come from.
We have to appeal to them on emotion, because we already know that a lot of these folks don't have a lot of formal education. And so they push back on anything that looks and sounds like formal education. Woke fucking coastal liberal elite shit.
Yeah.
I learned one of the most important lessons I learned in my program that was teaching me how to run for office as a Democratic woman was talk the way people listen. Mm-hmm. And it's really, really hard for me to dig into that principle right now because I'm so angry.
I know.
But I know that if you're ever going to make inroads with anybody who voted for this piece of fucking shit in the White House right now, you have to talk the way people listen or they're going to shut you off like that. Mm-hmm. And so it will come. Still not there yet.
I don't know what that had to do with anything.
I know.
Sorry, we went off on a big tangent.
Yeah.
But
it's late. Anyway, let's go back to we're going to go back to some real assholes, Nixon and Kissinger, and know that there were assholes long before Donald Trump. and
it's not new.
But what he's doing is new. We're not going to go into that necessarily. Big. But yeah, so let's talk about Kissinger and Nixon. I hate these motherfuckers. So during the 60s and the early 70s, Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, played pivotal roles in orchestrating and supporting CIA-backed coups in Latin America, most notably Chile. These interventions were primarily motivated by the Cold War concerns over the spread of leftist governments perceived as threats to American geopolitical and economic interests. But Jen thinks this is bullshit. That's literally what I wrote here. This is about U.S. economic interests first and foremost. There was some sort of like telecommunications company in Chile, and I think they also had copper. So they had rich resources there, and the U.S. was like, bring it on. So one of the most infamous examples was the coup against Chile's democratically elected president Salvador Allende that I mentioned. So Allende was a Marxist. He was rad. He was elected in 1970. His socialist policies, including nationalizing industries, especially copper, as I said, and land reforms, freaked U.S. businesses out. Particularly multinational companies like this is what it was, ITT, International Telephone and Telegraph. These things live in my mind rent free. I don't even need my notes. Nixon's orders. So Nixon instructed the CIA to make the Chilean economy scream, to destabilize Allende. He had a way with words, that piece of shit. Like when he was bombing Laos and Cambodia and calling it breakfast, lunch, and dinner because he wanted them bombed in the morning, afternoon, and evening.
Oh, that's gross.
These are people, and we weren't supposed to be bombing Laos and Cambodia in the Vietnam War. Anyway, back to the CIA. So he wanted the economy to scream. He wanted to destabilize the Allende government. This directive was part of what became known as Track 2, a covert operation aiming to support Chilean military factions in staging a coup. This is from the National Security Archives, guys. This isn't Jen's like communist literature. Like all of this stuff is available through the Freedom of Information
I love
Act.
how it's the Central Intelligence Agency, but it's all like written down.
Oh, yeah, I know. They had to. A lot of it's redacted. Like you look up some of this stuff, a lot of blacked out shit.
But was that McNamara and all that shit from Vietnam?
I don't know, man.
That was the last time I knew about stuff like this before I looked it up.
I hate Henry Kissinger with a passion. So he famously remarked, I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. Fuck democracy. Under his directions, the U.S. funneled millions of dollars to Chilean opposition groups and media to undermine Allende. And in 1973, September 11th, that was their September 11th, General Augusto Pinochet led a brutal military coup. Allende died during the assault on the presidential palace, and Pinochet established a military dictatorship that lasted until 1990. Yeah. Tons of human rights violations. Tons. Like I said, their national soccer stadium, Estadio Nacional, became a symbol of state terror and human rights abuses. It's awful. And I've read the accounts, and I wish I hadn't, especially from women. I wish I hadn't. So, I think I've said enough about this. I think you get it, but just give you a little fun fact here. Mass detentions. Between 12,000 and 20,000 detainees were held in the soccer stadium at different times in the weeks following the coup. Torture and executions. Prisoners were interrogated, tortured, and many were executed. Bodies were often disposed of secretly. Here's an infamous case. The beloved Chilean folk singer Victor Jara was tortured and killed in the stadium. Soldiers broke his hands before mocking him to sing. I can't even read this, you guys. Operation Condor. Let's talk about 1975 to 1980. This is, again, Nixon and Kissinger's legacy. Kissinger was also aware of the tacitly supported Operation Condor, a coordinated effort among right-wing dictatorship in Latin America to eliminate political opponents. This network, involving countries like Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, led to the assassination and disappearance of thousands of people. Wow. the human rights violations are off the charts.
Well, and don't you hate too, like Americans were the first ones to say like, oh, that's wrong.
Yeah.
Oh, that's uncivilized.
Yes. And they don't realize that we're the ones backing this.
Always.
So, okay. So I talked enough about, I think we've made it very clear what deposing a democratically elected leader does to the political landscape, to the economy for decades to come. Now, I think we need to talk about Mexico too, because a lot of the folks who are here currently, who are undocumented, are from Mexico. So we cannot, in good conscience, not talk about fucking NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. I used to know these people. They were friends of mine. And they had a punk band called Lorax. And they had a song that was called Down with NAFTA. Down with NAFTA. So badass.
It's a good punk song.
It was a great punk song. So NAFTA, implemented in 1994, thank you, Clinton, aimed to enhance economic integration between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. While it facilitated trade and investment, NAFTA also had significant implications for migration patterns from Mexico to the U.S. So we have agricultural displacement. NAFTA's reduction of trade barriers exposed Mexican farmers to competition with heavily subsidized U.S. agriculture. This competition led to a decline in Mexican agricultural prices, making it difficult for local farmers to sustain their livelihood. Consequently, many rural Mexicans faced economic hardship and they fled. They came here seeking employment. So manufacturing employment. While NAFTA boosted certain sectors in Mexico, such as manufacturing, the benefits were unevenly distributed. Anybody heard of the maquiladoras? Read up on that shit. Oh, it's awful. These are basically sweatshops that came about in conjunction with NAFTA. And you want to talk about abuse against women? Don't even get me started. Okay. The growth in manufacturing jobs did not compensate for the losses in agriculture, and many of the new jobs were concentrated in specific regions. So there were certain areas that had economic opportunity and certain regions that had nothing. And this is why it was so dangerous for women, because they were traveling long fucking distances to go to these maquiladoras, and they were getting raped and murdered. It's huge. Fuck, I can't remember the case. Oh, it's like anyway, I'll think of it and I'll do a TikTok about it. Okay. It's awful. So
yay.
This has an impact. Yeah. More fun stuff. This has an impact on migration trends, guys. In the decades following NAFTA's implementation, unauthorized immigration from Mexico to the U.S. more than doubled, rising from approximately 2.5 million individuals in 1995 to about 8 million by 2006. The surge indicates that the anticipated economic improvements in Mexico didn't materialize for a significant portion of the population. So Trump has vowed to deport everyone who's here illegally, as is evidenced by his first term and now his second term, where he was separating parents from children. The psychological implications of separating migrant children from their parents are profound and long-lasting, as we know. Numerous studies and expert analyses highlight the severe trauma and mental health consequences that can arise from this practice. Carolyn, you talked about a lot of this, but let's really drive it home. Let's really depress our listeners. I'm sorry about the vicarious trauma, y'all.
No.
This is why I drink.
I know. Cheers, Jen. So family separations as a tool of oppression is nothing new. And we can't really necessarily even blame the CIA for this. This has been going on throughout history. Sorry, I am like talking. I didn't talk all day. And I notice when I do that, I talk even weirder.
It's all coming out.
Anyway, so devastating psychological and societal consequences. So, again, the U.S. slavery and forced family separations, this was This has happened throughout history everywhere, but enslaved families routinely torn apart when children, parents, and spouses were sold to different plantations. Trauma and forced separations lasting intergenerational scars contributing to long-term distress in Black communities. I would even argue to say that you're still going to be able to see that in Black communities today because it didn't end and people are still being treated terribly. Indigenous boarding schools. This is something that I invest a lot of my time in learning about. And I think I mentioned my sister is an attorney with First Nations and Native American populations. Awesome. So just vicariously through listening to things she's talked about, Native American and First Nation children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in government and church-run boarding schools. They basically said, we want to erase Indigenous culture, language, identity, leading to deep-rooted trauma, substance abuse, mental health struggles that you're still seeing in those communities today. Your and My Trauma, the Holocaust. Jewish families were separated in Nazi concentration camps, with children often sent to death while parents were forced into labor, or vice versa. Survivors suffered severe PTSD, depression, intergenerational trauma. Continuing to their descendants, you talked about Argentina's dirty wars, military dictatorships, kidnapped children of political descendants and placed them with regime-friendly families. Many of these children, now adults, still struggle with these identity crises. I won't go into more of these, but Australian stolen generations, that's another thing you're going to want to look into if you have ever studied about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families and being put into foster home. We talked about U.S. immigration policies, 2018 zero tolerance policy and beyond. Let's get to the psychological pattern. So again, nothing new. It shouldn't take a genius to realize that children are the most vulnerable population in the history of our lives. I would say the children and the elderly, right? But even more so children. Yeah. I don't know if I could do a coin toss on that, but I'm going to, I don't know. I don't have to choose. Sophie's choice, but in a different way. So, you shouldn't have to think that. And I think that's always the travesty of all these political and global atrocities, is that it's between white men, but who are the people that suffer? The women and the children.
Well, that's one of my favorite proverbs, and I can't remember what country in Africa it comes from, but it's something along the lines of like, when elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. So you have these, in this case, these. Yeah.
Oh, we didn't even talk about Africa.
Oh, God. Oh, man. Don't get me started.
Yeah. So, I don't know why that's not more shocking to people. And we witnessed this in our lifetime, too, with what we saw during Trump's first administration. Where we saw children being detained and separated from their families. And I don't understand what's wrong with the other humans that are around us, that wasn't something. And that's something that we saw in real time in media, hearing people. Because you could argue, as I've watched a lot of these documentaries and listening to you, that, okay, well, at that time they were keeping things secret. People didn't have access to this stuff. The media maybe wasn't showing that. But as you go further along in time, people are. Right. And what's different, we've talked about this before, that was what the overlining pattern that existed is what's different now is we can see this stuff and it's real time. Yeah. And we have to band together as communities, because the toxic stress and trauma, not only is it impacting those people, it's impacting now us who are viewing it.
And I think the age-old psychological question that we're constantly asking on this show, and that people with conscience, no, I don't want to say people with conscience because I'm making a value judgment. But how...
That's really nice of you, Jen.
I'm trying not to be a total dick tonight. But how a guard at a detention camp could take a 2-year... I've read stories that made me sob. And what is it about a lot of human beings? I don't think I would be capable of this. I know you wouldn't be capable of this. To tell myself, this is the job, this is what needs to be done.
To a child.
Right.
Let alone to an adult.
I couldn't.
It's bizarre.
I couldn't.
I think you're missing. Something's wrong.
Right.
Something's sociologically wrong.
It fucking happens.
I think it speaks to the indoctrination and the cult-like nature of this, that from that's the only perspective I can make sense of. It doesn't make it right, but these are, you should know that abruptly forcing a separation from a parent and a child is going to trigger toxic stress in a child. Yeah. It's going to categorically disrupt brain development and lead to PTSD.
Well, even if it's not your child.
But that's what people are being taught. That's also the same rhetoric, is that these people are subhuman and they don't deserve rights because they're taking their existence is not as valuable as mine.
It's an us versus them paradigm.
Thing, and it's sick and it's gross, and it should not exist still, but that seems to be the thing.
I hear other immigrants saying it.
That I don't understand.
I don't
understand that.
immigrants.
Because I'm thinking just white person to white person.
No. Well, I think you've internalized your oppression. And I can't speak for anybody of color, but I can only rationalize it as you've internalized your oppression and you think you are going to get more privilege by speaking the language of the white power majority.
You're still not white, though.
You're no.
So it's going to happen to you.
Yeah, you're still exactly. That's the thing. Donald Trump, these folks who voted for Donald Trump, the people of color, I don't know why they can't see that he doesn't give a fuck about them any more than he gives a fuck about their undocumented brothers and sisters.
Is it just an extreme hatred of government in general and they see him as the anti-government?
I don't think so. I think there's like a love of a strong man. I mean, I've had conversations with immigrants about this. And I see the conversations I've had, and I know this doesn't sum up the rationale for every immigrant who voted for him. But the person that I spoke to talked about really liking his policies, loving like the strong man vibe. This person also had a lot of anti-Black rhetoric. They're from Nicaragua. A lot of anti-Black rhetoric. So all the anti-Black shit that Trump espouses really speaks to them.
But and that's the logic you and I say, well, if it's sort of like how I don't like hanging out with the gossip, because it's like, well, if you're gossiping to me, I'm not going to tell you things. Because I don't believe that you and I have some trust that's not going to eventually do that.
Totally.
Well, and I ask you to think back to, you see children. I worked in a preschool recently, and you see the healthy sadness that happens when when you have to leave your child. Right. They cry, they get upset. But if they're in safe spaces, these aren't safe spaces that they're going to.
No. This is a prison.
These are my mind won't allow me to think what happens.
Yeah.
But there is attachment disruptions that occur, and we all can resonate with that. We all have that feeling of when our parents left and had to go somewhere and we'd be sad. I can't imagine that feeling. I'm not going to imagine that. But this bond, when it's forcibly broken, it ruins you. And again, I'm not saying that you're inherently broken because this has happened to you. I think that's when resilience steps in.
Yeah.
And, but these are children.
Right.
And it's just, So not only are you going to see the mental issues, but the physical health issues that come from that, the malnutrition, the chronic illness, the immune system dysfunction. And that's, a stress hormone. That's if they're not enduring just egregious things in these places.
Yeah.
At that point, loss of cultural identity and intergenerational trauma, they might not even make it. Your body may not want you to survive from that point.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know how else to package this to someone but I think again, it's going back, and you've always seen that in, how do you look at the Holocaust? How do you look at Armenian genocide? How do you look at things that have happened throughout history? These are, quote, casualties of war. Mm-hmm. And that's a disgusting way to put in if that's what we're willing to do. Collateral damage.
That's disgusting.
And you can look at all this stuff. You can check out, and I have my problems with the APA as well, but American Psychological Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, there are numerous trauma specialists and organizations that have well documented. And the fact that you even have to document this, it kind of, to me, seems like, why are we wasting money on that research? Don't you just know that?
Yeah. A lot of people don't.
All right, fair. But I'm done researching stuff. We have to do something different.
I agree.
So I agree. I don't know what to say, but it hurt. You and I love children, and
what I will say is any MAGA fuck who says, well, that's their parents' fault for trying to bring them here illegally. It's like, if you just listen to everything that we just said, which wasn't nearly enough about the situations that are going on in a lot of these countries where our policies directly contributed to these not being safe places for these people to remain, then I don't know how else to get through to you.
Right.
If you can look at a child crying alone in a fucking cell
and say they deserve it,
or that it's their parents' fault, like, what the fuck is wrong with you? You're the same people probably who are anti-abortion who want to fucking cut school lunches. You got, oh,
well,
God.
And that's the hypocrisy, and it contradicts itself. And I think it really does boil down to this idea that there's scarcity, and that if the US has indoctrinated many for years. Well, and that was the thing that made this documentary so in the Turning Point documentary is, they talk about the Cold War and starting with, we talked about this with disaster capitalism, that, children at that time were going through what your son goes through and having to do active shooter.
Yeah.
They were having to go up against a wall. And so there was this inherent thing that others outside of the United States is safe and is here to protect you, and everyone else is bad. And it makes me wonder if those were the same kids that also, because the only way I can find in my granola crunchy healer therapist mind, some compassion.
Yeah.
Because I looked at that and I went, oh, those kids, their emotions got hijacked. Mm-hmm. Their nervous systems got hijacked, and they were taught that America will protect you. Everyone else is bad. Mm-hmm. And what does that do to an entire generation of baby boomers?
It does. And
their children.
Yes. And you talked about the education system and not learning any of this. That's deliberate.
I didn't.
Because you consistently want to look at the U.S. as this patriarchal savior that's here to protect you, or the government rather, instead of saying, oh shit, like I'm fucked because of U.S. policies here and abroad. Like nobody wants to, not nobody, but a lot of people don't even know to look at the system or to blame the system for the situation that they're in, because the people that are perpetuating the system are saying, no, it's the immigrants. No, it's Black folks. Oh, it's DEI.
I just had a massive aha moment. So you know how you were saying, sorry, grad school.
I honor it.
You were saying that you're not super emotionally detached to your family.
Super emotionally attached. Yeah.
If you have that same paternalistic and maternalistic feeling that America has given people.
Yeah.
Think of the hardest, like for me, the hardest thing has been coming to terms with both the devil and the good and the bad of my family. Mm-hmm. And I think that's most people as they mature, they have to realize, wow, my parents were infallible.
Right.
And I can still love the parts of them that I love. But there were some things that were really fucked up. And I also understand where they came from with that.
Yeah.
I think we're dealing with a whole generation who's having that same, but I was taught that the CIA protects.
Yeah.
And is keeping national security. These are the same people who were raised in Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And everyone else is bad. White is good. America is good. Defend our boys. Defend democracy.
Yeah.
And now you're kind of showing them the dark side of that.
Yeah.
And they're having kind of an existential crisis.
Yeah. But they're dying out. And so,
but they raised a generation.
Yeah.
Of incels who are angry.
And it's true. And we'll end with this because we're talking a lot. I think in this last election, it showed us something because so many of us and the pundits were like, the young people, they're going to save us. We saw young people voting, either not showing up or voting for Trump, not across the board, but in larger numbers than we thought were going to happen because the young people are supposed to know better. What the fuck?
That's the first time that's happened.
But this is economic inequality.
Yeah.
The chasm between the haves and the have-nots has gotten worse. The ability to access a college education has become financially more difficult.
Yep.
So you're angry. We got a lot of young, angry people who can't even afford to necessarily move out of their parents' house, which means they're sitting around and they're listening to their fucking parents all day.
Or Joe Rogan,
God forbid. Anyway, this brings us to the end of today's episode. We explored the profound and lasting impact of CIA-backed coups in Latin America. We talked about Guatemala, Chile, and beyond. We've seen how U.S. intervention reshaped the political, economic, and social landscapes of entire nations. These covert operations didn't just remove leaders. Their ripple effects led to decades of dictatorship, human rights violations, economic instability, and deep social divisions that still shape the region today. And oh, by the way, are responsible for a lot of out-migration. So thank you for tuning in. We hope you learned something. we preach to the choir a lot, so we're sure you enjoyed this episode, and a lot of the stuff we said probably wasn't new to you, but we love you for listening. Don't forget to follow us on TikTok for as long as it's still around. We're TWAT, TWATJC. And then we're also The World According to Jen and Carolyn on Instagram, and I think that's all we've got. TikTok,
YouTube, and all those places.
All that shit. So anyway, we appreciate y'all listening. Get riled up, resist, get your asses in the street. We can make a difference. Love you all. Bye.
Love you. Bye.